Right. Okay. One thing we didn't do, well, I didn't do as a facilitator, was to enunciate what a volcanologist is. So that would be a good question to ask in each of you. What is a volcanologist?
Well, I guess in the broadest terms, it's a volcano researcher. But yeah, it is a broad term, because volcanologists tend to be a jack of all trades. You'll find that people with a wide variety of specialties call themselves volcanologists, and it sort of arises naturally that way when you work on volcanoes, especially active volcanoes, is that you have to adapt to do whatever needs to be done in a variety of situations, and so you do become a generalist.
Okay.
I guess I would say that a volcanologist is a student of volcanoes, volcanic geology, and volcanic processes. I agree with Rick's comment about jack of all trades. In fact, at the time that I joined the Geological Survey, I think one of the things that really drew me into geology and into the Geological Survey was that it was an opportunity for a person who was broadly based. You could expect to deal with a wide variety of geologic problems. And HVO, when I got introduced to active volcanoes, I was able to participate in all aspects. I wasn't trained as a seismologist, for example, but I learned a lot about volcano seismology and felt free to get in the discussion and participate in interpreting what was going on in the volcano.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think volcanology really brings people from different disciplines together and trying to interpret what's happening. There's often, I think, a feeling that volcanology deals only with what's happening today or in the very recent past, in the last few decades or hundreds of years. But I think a lot of people consider themselves volcanologists that are dealing with rocks that are millions and maybe even billions of years old too, because they're looking at the deposits from the standpoint of the eruptive process, the volcanologic process. I think most of us would probably tend to emphasize the recent active volcanoes, but I think the term is broader than that.
Okay. Another question that I thought that we should explore kind of in a general sense is what inspires you to do the work that you do, and do you feel that your work is valuable? And I'll just use valuable because valuable could be in the sense of the research aspect, but also as intangible products that we would provide for the end user, the public, who pays our salaries. So I'm leaving valuable in a very loose sense.
Well, I think that one of the things that inspires me and probably all of us is curiosity. We like to understand how things work, and in this case particularly volcanoes. I'm very much interested in the significance of the deposits produced by volcanoes in terms of what they tell us about the eruptive behavior of a volcano. So to a large extent, it is curiosity driven, and maybe it was in the NRC report. I think there was a quotation about that scientists do this because they want to know, and I think that's a very, very strong motivation. I also think there are other rewarding parts of this, and for me some of that has been interaction with public officials, particularly emergency management officials, in trying to address and plan for volcanic crises, and when I actually got into that, I felt that was a pretty rewarding enterprise.
I agree with Ed as one of the key motivators in this business is curiosity. I mean, that's what brought me into science in general. As far as is this valuable, you didn't really think I was going to say that what we do isn't valuable, do you? I mean,
you're supposed to be honest on camera.
Maybe I should ask you, is it esoteric?
Yeah, I think it's valuable, and I think we're fortunate to work in this field because not only can we work in a very rich scientific field, but for much of what we do, there's a direct, immediate payoff in public service, because the information that we develop feeds directly back into hazard and crisis mitigation.
Yeah, I agree that it's really a mix of scientific curiosity and public social concerns that really drive me. To me, the most important issue is the scientific curiosity, just like Ed said, because I think we have to have that curiosity to really devote ourselves to the extent that we do to understanding volcanic process. And if we can understand that process, then you can spin off from that any number of things, including safety for society. But I've never received quite the good feelings from doing research that I do from helping the public. Now, I've kind of surprised myself, but over the years, some of the biggest rewards for me at Mount St. Helens were taking hiking groups into the crater and explaining to them what was happening there and seeing light bulbs light up, and they came away with an understanding that they wouldn't have had at all. Or at HVO now, if we tell the park management that there's an earthquake swarm happening in the caldera and we would recommend them closing off the summit area, they close off the summit area and they get people out of there. I mean, there's an immediate payoff, and that's just a great feeling to have, because that's spinning off of our scientific curiosity and scientific drive, but yet it's something that's really relevant to society.
Okay, let's explore that angle. In Hawaii, the eruptions are so frequent that our relationship with, let's say, civil defense has been nurtured and cultivated over many years and is actually quite good, whereas when emergency managers get a directive from the observatory that something's happening and they listen without questioning. But has that always been true? And are there ways that in other places where, well, what do you think is the reason why HVO has such a good, solid reputation with emergency managers? And in other places, maybe that's not necessarily true. So what has HVO done to ensure success, or maybe even in the days of Mount St. Helens, what ultimately led to that success?
Well, I think there's nothing that's stronger than having to live with something every day. And in Hawaii, if not every day, at least every few years, there is an eruption that unfortunately has covered a lot of populated area over the past 50 years, Lower Puna, and Kalapana, and so forth. And so I think that there's just a heightened awareness on the part of the residents of Hawaii, and consequently their civil defense people. Even though memories are short, they aren't quite short enough to completely remove that kind of memory. I think the situation is far more difficult at volcanoes that don't erupt as frequently as certainly Rick's experience has shown.
Yeah, I can't speak to the HBO experience because I've spent so little time there so far. But in foreign volcano responses that I've attended, there's the relationship between scientists and decision makers is, the relationship varies depending on circumstance. It's run the gamut from excellent to terrible, in my experience. Of course, at HVO, this is something that's been ongoing for decades, sure, and things have been worked out. It's much more difficult when you put in a situation where this mechanism doesn't exist. Somebody you haven't seen before, doesn't know you, doesn't know whether to trust you. So you have to try and establish credibility with these people, and you have to do that the hard way, which is credentials help somewhat, but nothing helps like accurate forecasts, information that a decision maker can use to in his job of dealing with the public and dealing with the crisis situation.
I know that both you and Ed have direct first-hand experience in Pinatubo, so maybe you can talk about that and the relationship of you advising them and first of all whether or not you had any credibility and what things actually, like you said, the forecast was accurate, and that was the biggest spike in your credibility. But prior to that, I mean, was it communication? Was it openness about the possibilities? Which were the things that actually fostered a congenial relationship?
Well, Ed and I weren't the only USGS volcanologists at Pinatubo. We were preceded by Chris Newhall. And Chris had the most difficult time of it, I think, in terms of establishing credibility with the people with whom we interacted, because they didn't know him from Adam. And but Chris laid that foundation and got us off to a good start, particularly with the Air Force at Clark Air Base, where we were had set up our operation. And it wasn't just the USGS there. We were there as colleagues of the Philippine Volcanological Survey.
Right.
And so we worked very closely with those people, both in the field, in monitoring and collecting data, and in disseminating data. They took the lion's share of the dissemination load for the Philippine population, whereas we interfaced more with the military, mm-hmm. which had been both the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy, both of which had large facilities in the Philippines at that time.
I would emphasize that in responses to volcanic crises in other countries, general rule of thumb is that we are there to support the local volcano scientists. Mm-hmm. That was very strongly the case in the Philippines. Chris Newhall is the sort of the godfather of the whole USGS response, emphasized that, and I think we were very careful to try to maintain that role. We were simply there to help them, and by and large I think that works well, because if anybody has an in with the local emergency managers, it should be the local volcanologists. So we're in a sort of a delicate situation in another country. With respect to Pinatubo specifically, I agree with Rick's comments. I think the Air Force was the most difficult agency for us to deal with. I wasn't there at the time, but what I understand is that there was tremendous skepticism on the part of the Air Force, and many people who sort of held the view, well, these are just a bunch of scientists trying to get some grant money, and and it was difficult. The craft videos on understanding volcanic hazards and mitigating volcanic hazards, I think, played a big role in helping people understand. And one of the problems is there were very few people in the Philippines who even had a clue that Pinatubo was a volcano, and so you have to overcome a tremendous amount of resistance based on short-term human experience. At the same time, Chris Newhall had long experience in the Philippines, knew the director of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology very well, and I think that went far in making our working relationship with the Philippine volcanologists much easier than it would have been otherwise.
Okay, good. As a volcano hazards team, as membership there, we're looked, as far as within the United States, as a premier organization, and yet there are some things that we can improve upon. So what three things, right off the top, there are more than three, but which three things come to the forefront in your minds that we can actually do better?
You mean the USGS or the community as a whole?
You can address either way. You can address whether it's us or the volcanologic community. I think either discussion of either or would be very valuable.
Top three, huh? Well, I'll speak for the USGS. My opinion of one thing, I think we need to put more effort into physical volcanology, volcano process modeling. There's some of that going on. I think we need to be doing a lot more of it. I'd like to see us acquire people capable of excelling in that area. There's one.
Well, it's always, and will probably always be important and appropriate to expand our collection of tools and techniques and the understanding, expand the understanding of volcanic processes that they enable us to achieve. That's got to continue as a high priority. I think that somehow, and I don't know how we address this in the present framework, but we've got to do better at attracting bright young scientists into the USGS. And of course, the problem has really been imposed on the USGS, but it's a very serious problem, and we probably wouldn't be here if the agency wasn't turning into what one colleague calls a gerontocracy.
I think another area that would be useful for us to put some more effort in is crisis management, and that is not just the on-the-job training type of crisis management, but maybe more formal expertise in that area. I mean, none of us were trained formally in that sort of thing, and have gathered what we have by happenstance. And I think that our program probably should try to acquire somebody that can deal with this stuff on a more holistic level.
Well, I think that we do need to expand our research capability too, and I would also emphasize physical volcanology as Rick did. A problem is getting young people into the organization, as Ed mentioned. What's probably not realized by many people outside the USGS is that if a USGS volcanologist retires, that opens a slot. Even if somebody is hired by the USGS, there's no guarantee that that person is going to be a volcanologist. He could be in some other field. And so as a result, there's no way to continue to nourish the volcanology program in the USGS that's guaranteed, and yet we need it desperately. We need new blood desperately. Another shortcoming, I think, of USGS operations is that we don't take into account the necessity for better working relationships on a daily basis with the academic community. I think we really suffered over the long haul by not nurturing those relationships, particularly during crisis times. And now when it's so difficult for us to to keep our scientific manpower up, it's even more important, I think, that we draw upon the expertise that's so vast and deep in the academic community. And another thing I think that we're weak in, but we are improving thanks to some work being done at EVO, is our ability to gather, use, and interpret remote sensing data. I think this is something that is really blossoming within the academic community, within NASA, and USGS has fallen behind on that, and at least broadly speaking, the USGS volcanology community. So to me, those are the three largest areas that I think need improvement now.
So how do we overcome the lack of hiring? I mean, what's the problem there, and is it because there aren't any volcanologists out there, or is it because we don't have any money? Is it because of policy?
Well, as they say, that's above my grade level.
Smart answer.
Well, it's partly shortage of financial resources. The program, as I understand it, stays flat-funded year after year while costs go up. And in addition, the cost of contracting government, which generally I think we'd probably all think is an admirable thing to do, means that agencies like the Geological Survey also get contracted, and what that means is that young people aren't hired. The whole Geological Survey has some very advanced average age. I don't know the number, but it's
I think I heard 47.
I'm surprised if it's that young, but
I heard it was older.
yeah.
But anyway.
Well, maybe if you take researchers, it's an older age.
This may have been the whole lot.
Anyway, these are things that are hard for the survey to address from within, and I don't know what the answer is.
Okay.
We do more and more with less and less.
Yeah. I think there is an answer, and that's a question of priorities. And of course, getting management to accept our sense of priority is what we would like to have done. But every other group in the USGS has a different sense of priority, and they'd like to have management follow their priorities too. So there is no easy answer to this, but regardless of that, we need to try to figure out how to overcome this issue. And a way is to involve more of the academic community, I think, through contracts, research grants, extramural grants, and so forth.
Okay. I was wondering that, what we do, all of us seem to value. Do you think that as a vehicle that we need to then represent what it is we do to the people that actually have the funding and sell them on the idea that what we're doing is actually valuable and convince them in some way? For example, when we were on the chopping block, I think it was in 1996, on the congressional chopping block, right after that, there was this advent of taking a lesson from NASA, but in a very small way, that we have to have our own PR service. Do you think that's something that we need to do? I know as scientists you think fundamentally we should probably be looking at the scientific questions more, but in this day and age, is that something that we should pursue?
A PR service, you mean to whom? To the public?
I think that the public is the taxpayers. To some degree, we have to convince them that what we're doing is valuable, but then also we got to convince the people sitting up on the hill.
That's what we call outreach.
And we're doing plenty of that now, certainly.
And we do direct a lot of our efforts to that now, a lot more than we used to. Given our resources, I think we do quite a bit of it.
I think getting back to one of the things that you mentioned before, Rick, is that that we have to cultivate these relationships, and so I'm just wondering that I think that the USGS has lots to learn from NASA in that way, and actually blow our own horn if we want to use that and ensure the fact that we get the funding that we need and hire the new people before Ed's already retired, but you need to mentor someone and transfer what we're trying to capture on videotape.
I think it's possible that there needs to be a greater effort in Washington, D.C., but I think one thing that goes a long way toward building support is having recognized contributions at the local level. My understanding is that during the John Kasich crisis, where abolition of the USGS was threatened, that a lot of the USGS salvation came from local people involved with water problems, stream monitoring, and that sort of thing, who highly valued the contribution of the USGS to their problems and spoke up by contacting their Congress people or whatever. And I think in the volcano program, to the degree that we can provide good service, have strong interactions with the public and with local officials, we gain ground. I think we've done some of that in Washington State, and I think that at least among a small community related to emergency management, I think we probably have very strong supporters in Washington State. But it takes time, and it's a difficult problem because it requires a big investment of time of a person or people to maintain those relationships. I think the people who are best suited to do it are people who have a lot of scientific credibility and a lot of background, and that kind of effort really competes with one's scientific work. So it's a problem, and I don't think we address the problem very well in our agency. In fact, I think it's one of the agencies, at least in the geologic division, a failure. We have not figured out how to value that kind of work when it comes to promotions.
I think it's a hard sell to Congress and to state governments when we only have an eruption in the lower 48 every X decades. that just isn't often enough, and so
in a very few states.
And in a very few states, yeah. And so that really means that it's all the more important, I think, to maintain some level of interaction, some strong level of interaction with the public in at least those states. And I think the best way to do that is to go into the schools and try to get volcanic hazards as a part of the curriculum, and some X hours in some scientific program at say a 6th grade level, and then repeat that at some higher grade level, just to keep the awareness in the people who are growing up to become the next leaders that there is a problem.
There's no shortage of interest amongst the general public in volcanoes and volcanology in general. If the number of requests that we receive at CVO from Discovery Channel and operations like that for help in producing videotape is any indication. So, but somehow we have not been able to parlay that innate interest in the public into more resources. But ultimately, this is a management decision. Management has their priorities. They've got so much money on the table, and they have to allocate it in some fashion. And in those allocations, we have been just sort of holding the line or slowly slipping back.
That's right.
Okay. Don mentioned the fact that one of the things that maybe we should do is cultivate our relationship with academia. And I'd like to explore that a little bit. Do you think then that the USGS should maybe, for example, stick to the monitoring aspects of volcanology and let the basic science occur in academia, or what do you envision as far as cultivating that relationship and ensuring the kinds of regional expertise that we have?
Well, since I brought this up, I'd like to say that I don't separate monitoring from research. I think monitoring is a data gathering phase of research, and so as such, I think that academia can take part in monitoring as well as what is normally called research. For example, there's nothing to say that some university or some student group couldn't take on a volcano and be in charge of the geodetic monitoring at that volcano, say, removing the need for us to do that. And this could be done through an extramural grant program. But certainly the strongest expertise, I think, on the academic side is through the fundamental research that they can do that we either can't or don't want to do or aren't funded to do or whatever. And I would envision that would be where most of the academic input would come. And I want to say that I think this is true not only for domestic issues, but I think internationally too. The VDAP program, for example, I think could strongly benefit from having this input from dedicated and insightful academic people.
VDAP does have those relationships with some academicians. I think that if you're going to have this sort of relationship, it's something that has to be nurtured before you get involved in a crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you have to develop these working relationships so that you're both on the same page at the same time when a crisis arises. You can't try and it's very difficult to try and arrange these things in the midst of a crisis.
Right.
Mount St. Helens being a case in point.
Yeah. Although at St. Helens, I think we erred in not getting the academic community more involved. Certainly during the summer after May 18th, but I would say even before May 18th.
No, that's what I'm saying.
There's a lot more that could have been done then.
There were understandably many people in the academic community that wanted to be involved in St. Helens, and we were stretched. I guess an excuse is we were stretched so thin. We did not give it a lot of our attention to try and develop these interactions on the fly.
Well, one of the problems during a crisis like that is that in the short term, your first obligation is public safety and in support of the non-scientists who are managing the emergency, and that has to flavor everything that you do. But I think it would be possible if we had already had established collaboration with university scientists or university groups, that they then could be fairly easily folded in as part of the team.
Yeah, as long as they know what our priorities are. The problem comes is that an academician doesn't necessarily have the same priorities as the USGS when a crisis arises. They're there as a data collector for research. Now, I'm not saying that that's everybody, but that is certainly strongly represented. And it's difficult for us to work with that, to fold that information into our operation. There's also friction that flows out of that, because though we're charged with the responsibility of providing information to decision makers and putting the research side of our job description aside for the moment, ultimately our reward system is based on our science. And so when you're tending to business and somebody shows up on your doorstep to eat your lunch, there's some understandable animosity. That's why these things have to be worked out ahead of time, so that you've got a good working relationship and you both have the same priorities.
Well, I certainly agree that these relationships have to be worked out in advance, but I would say that having different priorities is a strength, not a weakness, because there could be the research side that is trying to get as much as they can out of the eruption in real time to understand the process, whereas we, because of the Stafford Act or whatever, we have to concentrate more on the hazards angles. In the short term, it may be our public warnings that have the biggest payoff for that particular eruption, but conceptually at least it would be the research, the findings that would have the longest payoff down the road, down decades or centuries down the road. So to me, there may be different ways of looking at things, different priorities, but they're all a part of the overall package of trying to in both the short term and the long term, understand the volcano better to mitigate hazards. So to me, that's not a big issue. As far as eating one's lunch, well, this depends upon how cultivated the relationship is beforehand, and if we're concentrating our time on the monitoring, then how could we? Then the kind of lunch that we would eat ourselves would be very much more meager than that of a research group that was involved with the research most of the time during that same eruption. So you see, to me, I think you can all blend these things with the careful advanced planning, cultivation, and discussions of the groups involved.
I think that one of the points, though, is that in the case of the USGS, if we're there to do the hazards appraisal and work with emergency managers, then the reward system has to then, in what Rick's trying to allude to, is then reward him for that as opposed to making some end publication, which is a reward or is the current standard.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's a difficult.
You won't get any argument from me on that.
I have a problem with the idea that we would somehow divide into monitoring and research. This is what Don emphasized earlier, and our whole capability in monitoring depends on our understanding the processes. I think we have to have a collaboration that isn't so polarized, but is much more integrated with whoever we're going to collaborate with. We can't turn research over to other groups and maintain our ability to deal with crises, and we should just not even think in those
Well, none of us
terms.
are talking about compartmentalizing this, are we?
Right.
Well, I just want to emphasize that we don't.
We got it in the record.
I guess I've had a sense in the geologic division that there has been some campaigning for in the direction of making the geologic division more of a research management agency than a research agency. I find that very disturbing.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Yeah.
I don't think any of us disagree with that. Maybe it's time for a break.